Zealand. Hope you're all having a super fantastic sparkling day. Welcome to Porchlight Letters podcast number 2357. Our question for today on genealogy is, how do family stories disappear within a few generations? First of all, I've got to apologize for being on an hour early. It's that I had a change in appointments yesterday to 6 p.m. Pacific time or around then. So I needed to get this done and out of the way because I don't know how long the other one's going to take. And so here we are. And this is our second day of doing questions on genealogy and telling family stories. Family stories are so important, and it's one thing that I love helping people find and discovering is their family stories. So family stories do not fade slowly. They disappear suddenly. And it's the truth. It's not something that just disappears, that fades away like a lot of things in life do. People fade in and out of your life, and then there's those that just suddenly disappear. Family stories are one of those. So stories are passed orally rely on people, not paper. So think about the cultures where they have the oral storytellers, and they pass the stories on from generation to generation to generation. But then there are those where the stories fade over time, they get forgotten about and things like that as well. Each generation shortens and simplifies the memories. So rather than telling you the story with all the emotions and the descriptions and the excitement or the sadness and putting all the emotion into that storytelling, they tell them, instead of telling the big saga, they tell this. I like the saga stories, and some people who have listened to some of my stories know that I like saga stories because I go on and on and on and on. But I'm so excited and so passionate when I tell the stories that it helps people stay interested as well. So sometimes in generations, it's just like, I really can't tell. Let me shorten it a little bit, and it gets shorter and shorter, and it's gone. One storyteller passing can erase decades of knowledge. So there are cultures where they have the oral storytellers, and they find somebody within their culture that has those storytelling traits, and they train them to be a storyteller, and they pass along to them all the stories that they know. But if the training doesn't finish, or the storyteller suddenly dies, boom, all that knowledge has gone from one person. Yes, they may have passed some on to younger generations. Some people within the community may remember some of those stories, but many will not. And those stories will disappear because that person has disappeared from life. Busy lives push storytelling aside. People don't want the big stories these days. They just want, give me the quick thing, like the 2 minute TikToks and the 2 minute reel, 3 minute reels, or whatever they are. They just want those short, concise stories. And the storyteller has to then figure out how to tell all the emotion and get across the depth of the story to people in a very short amount of time. People are just too busy to worry about storytelling. But I will tell you this, there are still people out there who want the big stories. They want to discover their roots. They want to go and visit places that their ancestors have come from and have lived, and go and learn the history about the area that their families have come from. They want to discover the story of their ancestors. Even though their ancestors may not be around today to tell the story, the history of that location is still around. And there are historians out there who would love to sit with people who want more detail than just the tourist bit. They want the in-depth, they want the traveler story. They want the travelers, those that have come here to learn and immerse themselves in the culture and learn how things were done back in the days of their ancestors. What was their lives like? To help give them, and that helps you give, especially if you had a relative an ancestor who lived in that town, 100, 200 years ago, learning how that town ran at that time, learning the history of that town, what it was like in that time, gives you an insight as to how your ancestors lived during that time. And from them, you can pick and pack, that you can find the pieces of the facts and everything else and wind them into the story. There may have been some historical event that happened in that town that your ancestor was involved with, but unless you go visit that town and you talk to the historian, you may not even know about it. Have you ever thought about that? It could just be in some local newspaper, which is just, one of those little newspapers that come out. It could be hidden in that, but it may not make it online to any of the websites, but it could be in their libraries. Think about that, because remember, there's only with taking in account to all of the millions and millions of records that are online that are available to do genealogy research with, that represents around about or less than 5% of all records available. 5. So if you can't find something online, it could be you got to get your butt over to, or find a genealogist who will go and do the research for you in that area to go look. But it's always fun to go there yourself, because then you get to learn the area, you get to hear the stories. Maybe your ancestor was a prominent person in that town and you didn't know it. It's just some rinky-dinky little town of about 3,000 in population. And your ancestor may have been a big deal in that town. But unless you go find out, you ain't gonna know. Anyway, written records preserve what memory cannot. So getting these stories down, talking to the older generation, learning the stories about their lives when they were growing up, helps you to preserve those memories and gives you an insight into that person's life, growing up during some historical event. Like I was talking with a client yesterday, and I was talking about, what was it like for you to go through COVID? What was 9/11 like for you? How did it impact your life? What changes were made in your life because of it? What about the Gulf War? Ever involved in that? He was born after that, so it didn't really matter, but that's okay. He had ancestors that were alive during that time, and going back to, I said, so you go back to like the 1910s, 1912s when the Spanish flu was and people were put into quarantine. Who in your ancestry was affected by that? And did they leave behind any journals or letters or something like that about what it was like to live during the Spanish flu and being in quarantine and having to wear masks and everything? Sound familiar? Fast forward to 2021, when we had the COVID. What was the impact on your personal life during that time? How did it match your ancestors' life 100 years beforehand? Think about things like that. Did you have ancestors who fought in World War II, World War One, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, any of the wars that have been going on over the last, however many years? What were their lives like? How did that impact them? Did they go and fight? Did they go overseas and fight for your country? What service were they in? What rank did they obtain? What were their military records? You can access their military records unless they're classified. But you can access military records online. So what was their life like? Were they in the Civil War? Did they fight for the American Revolution? Who in your tree fought for that? Find their stories. Find the stories and learn about them and go to different places. And I always remember, was it Chris O'Donnell? Chris Donnell on, he was on Who Do You Think You Are? Who Do You Think You Are? He was one that played one of the characters in NCIS LA. And he's had this big thing about family. Family is like super, super important. It's like the number one thing. And and he wanted to find out if it's been through, where did that come from? That sense of family and having to take care of family and putting family first, where did that come from? As they journeyed him through his ancestors, they found generation after generation after generation after generation of his grandfathers, going back several generations, who had left their position in the military where they were busy fighting a war and gone home because they were needed at home to take care of family, and how they took care of other families along the way as they were journeying back home. He even had I can't remember which grade, but he had a great grandfather who was at the fort in Baltimore. Was it Fort McHenry? Where they flew the Star Spangled Banner, and Francis Key Scott was out on one of the British boats at the time, trying to negotiate with them, and that's when he wrote the Star Spangled Banner, because he looked out in the morning, and the rockets red glare, the bombs bursting in air, and he looked out the next morning and the flag was still standing. The story from Fort McHenry's side, and they had Chris O'Donnell there explaining this to him, is that here is the flagpole. And this flagpole, come the next morning, there was a pile of bodies laying at the base laying around this flagpole, holding it upright, because the commander at Fort McHenry said that flag is not to fall at all. And these guys were literally laying their bodies down to protect that flagpole, make sure. And they said there's a pile of bodies. It indicated how far up it went, and that one of his great-grandfathers was there at Fort McHenry at the time when all of this was going on. So he learned that story about his grandfather being there. And then they gave him the honor of raising the flag up that flagpole in honor of his whatever great-grandfather. Then another one of his great-grandfathers was in the Civil War, I think it was. But he was at the Smithsonian Museum, and they handed him a letter that had been written by, I think it was like his third or fourth great-grandfather, handed him a letter that had been written by this gentleman explaining that he was returning his military kit because he had to go home because he was needed at home to protect and provide for his family. And he left with his military kit, and they handed Chris O'Donnell was it Chris O'Donnell or Chris Donnell? They handed him the sword that his third, fourth great-grandfather had used during the Civil War, along with some of the other bits and pieces. I had chills when I saw that story, and he actually got to read his great-great-grandfather's words in his own handwriting, and it just made it come alive. And I had chills all over watching this episode. It's one of the few where I've gotten chills on the whole thing. But being able to tell those stories, and now he could take those stories and tell his children about these men in their lives that had come before them. So it all matters because without intention, meaningful family stories can vanish in just 2 or 3 generations. It can be that quick. There are some that will linger and change over time and over the years. And people will come to me and say, hey, there's a rumor in our family that we're related to this particular person, or there's a rumor in our family about this incident that happened. And so now what our task is that we go and we create it as a theory, and then we go and prove or disprove the theory and research by doing research and come back and let them know. I'm going to see if I can get a client on here to tell her story about what we discovered and that with her, so that you can hear her story. It's a cool story. I have to tell you, it is a very cool story. So your practical takeaway for today is write stories down with voices while they are still available. Write your own story. What challenges have you been through? What was it like for you to go through COVID? What was it like for 9/11 for you? Think of historical things that have happened over your lifetime. Where were you and how did they affect you? And when it came to the time when Queen Elizabeth II passed away and her son Charles became King Charles III, that was a very historical moment. And I suddenly thought, hang on, her coronation was in 1953. My mum was alive during that time. So I got on with my mum and I said, what do you recall from this time? She says, well, you have to remember, we didn't have televisions back then. We sat around the radio listening to what was going on. She said, it didn't really affect us that much. We heard on the news that King George VI had passed away. She was now the Queen. And that happened while she was touring Africa. And so they then got her back home, and her coronation, and that was in 1952, and then her coronation was in 1953. And at the time when she was coronated, so this is really cool, just a few days before she was coronated, Sir Edmund Hillary and the Sherpa that was with him, conquered Mount Everest for the first time. That story didn't make it back to England till the day of the Queen's coronation. That's how close together those two events were. And so they told her about it as just before she was went through her coronation ceremonies and everything else. She was told that day of her coronation that Sir Edmund Hillary and the Sherpa had made it to the top of Mount Everest. So I thought, and that's how closely linked those two stories are. What do they have to do with my generation? I don't know. I don't know if there's, as far as I know, there's no relatives of mine that were involved in either incident and either event, except for the fact that my mother was alive at the time and my dad was alive. He doesn't remember anything of it, but my mum remembers kind of hearing about the king passing and about the coronation, and of course Edmund Hillary's conquering of Everest, and so things like that. So get those, and I tell you, since I've been back in New Zealand, I have heard stories about my parents' childhood I have never heard before, and I'm just sort of like, I've got to get these recorded. So your practical takeaway is write stories down while voices are still available, especially the older generation. Get them on record them if you need to, and then you can transcribe them later on. Want help preserving family stories, just send us a PM and we'll be more than happy to help and give you some hints and tips and things like that. And with that, our closing thought for today: if a story is not recorded, it is always at risk of being lost. So go out, have a super fantastic sparkling day, and we'll catch you guys back here tomorrow evening. Hang on, just checking my calendar. I think I'm at the normal. Yes, tomorrow evening at 6 p.m. Pacific.